The starship descended through the swirling violet clouds of a planet that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. From the viewport, the human visitor watched as crystalline spires emerged from the haze, their surfaces refracting light into cascades of colors that danced like living rainbows. He had been chosen for this mission not because he was extraordinary but because he was ordinary, a representative of humanity plucked from obscurity and thrust into the unknown. His name wasn't important here. It never had been. To the beings who inhabited this alien world, he was simply the guest, a title both respectful and enigmatic. They had summoned him weeks ago through channels no one fully understood, a transmission intercepted by Earth's most advanced satellites, carrying instructions written in mathematical patterns so intricate they bordered on poetry. The message had been clear: attend the ceremony of the Queen, or face consequences left ominously undefined. Now, standing at the threshold of what appeared to be some kind of grand hall, he felt the weight of his insignificance pressed down upon him. Around him, towering figures moved with fluid grace, their elongated limbs shimmering beneath translucent robes that seemed to ripple even when there was no breeze. Their faces were obscured behind masks made of iridescent material, each one unique yet eerily similar, glowing faintly with shifting hues that mirrored the emotions, or perhaps thoughts, of their wearers. He had expected awe, fear, maybe even confusion. What he hadn't anticipated was how utterly serene everything felt. There was no hostility, no sense of urgency, just an overwhelming calm that seeped into his bones and dulled the edges of his anxiety. It was unnerving in its perfection, like stepping into a dream where nothing could go wrong until suddenly, everything did. A figure approached him, taller than the rest, adorned in robes that shimmered silver and gold. Its mask bore intricate carvings resembling fractals, spiraling outward in endless complexity. Without speaking, it extended a hand, not quite human, with too many joints and skin that gleamed like polished stone, and gestured for him to follow. He hesitated only briefly before complying, knowing instinctively that resistance would be futile. As they walked, the air around them hummed softly, vibrating against his eardrums in a way that made words unnecessary. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, walls lined with glowing runes that pulsed in time with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Occasionally, smaller beings darted past, their movements quick and insect-like, carrying objects he couldn't identify. None of them acknowledged him directly, though he caught glimpses of curiosity in the way their heads tilted ever so slightly in his direction. Finally, they arrived at a massive archway framed by twisting vines of luminous crystal. Beyond it lay a vast chamber bathed in soft, golden light. At its center stood a dais, atop which sat a throne carved from what looked like solidified starlight. And seated upon the throne was the Queen. She, or at least, he assumed it was female based on the flowing elegance of her form, was unlike anything he had imagined. Her body seemed composed entirely of light, shifting and refracting as if she were simultaneously present and absent. Her eyes, impossibly large and deep, locked onto his with an intensity that froze him mid-step. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. The guide who had led him here bowed low, then retreated silently, leaving him alone before the Queen. She rose slowly, her movements hypnotic, and descended the steps of the dais with deliberate care. When she finally stopped mere inches away, he realized she was taller than any of the others he'd encountered, her presence commanding every ounce of his attention. And then she spoke, not with words, but with thoughts that invaded his mind like whispers carried on the wind. "You are the guest," she said, her voice resonating within him rather than outside. "Welcome to our celebration." Before he could respond, the room erupted in motion. Figures swarmed around them, forming intricate patterns that reminded him of synchronized dancers performing under a spotlight. Music filled the space, though it came not from instruments but from vibrations that resonated through the very fabric of reality itself. Notes hung suspended in the air, visible as shimmering threads of color that wove together into tapestries of sound. He stood rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by the sensory overload. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong, that he didn't belong here, yet something deeper, a primal part of him he barely recognized, whispered that he did. That somehow, impossibly, this moment had been waiting for him all along. The Queen reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his cheek. The touch sent a jolt through him, electric and warm, filling him with a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. Then, without warning, the scene shifted. The music faded, the dancers stilled, and the light dimmed until only the queen remained illuminated. "This is more than a ceremony," she told him, her mental voice softer now, almost tender. "It is a convergence. A joining of paths long set in motion." He wanted to ask what she meant, to demand answers to the questions swirling in his mind, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself nodding, accepting her cryptic explanation as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the stillness shattered. The queen stepped back, raising her arms high above her head. Light exploded outward from her form, engulfing the chamber in brilliance so intense it blinded him. When his vision cleared moments later, he saw that the others had formed a circle around him, their masks glowing brighter than ever before. They began to chant, their voices blending into a single, harmonious tone that reverberated through his skull. The language was unfamiliar, yet somehow comprehensible, each syllable resonating with meaning he couldn't articulate. As they chanted, the floor beneath his feet began to shift, rising upward in concentric rings that formed a new platform at the center of the room. Without thinking, he climbed onto it, drawn by an invisible force he couldn't resist. Once there, he turned to face the queen, who now stood at the edge of the circle, her expression unreadable behind her radiant visage. She raised one hand, pointing directly at him, and the chanting grew louder, more insistent. That was when he noticed the symbols etched into the platform beneath his feet. They glowed faintly at first, then brighter, pulsing in time with the rhythm of the chant. He tried to step back, but his legs refused to obey. Panic surged within him, clawing at the edges of his consciousness, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming sense of inevitability that washed over him. The queen lowered her hand, and the chanting ceased. Silence fell over the chamber, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the symbols beneath him began to rise, detaching themselves from the platform and floating upward until they surrounded him like a halo of light. He felt it then, a connection forming between himself and the beings around him, binding him to them in ways he couldn't understand. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was invasive, as if tendrils of thought were probing the deepest recesses of his mind. Memories surfaced unbidden, childhood dreams, forgotten fears, fleeting moments of joy and sorrow. Each one was examined, dissected, and absorbed by the collective consciousness surrounding him. Through it all, the queen watched, her gaze unwavering. When the process finally ended, leaving him trembling and gasping for breath, she stepped forward once more. This time, when she touched him, it wasn't just her hand that connected with his skin, it was her essence, pouring into him like liquid fire. "You are more than you know," she whispered, her voice echoing not just in his mind but in his soul. "And now, you are ours." The realization hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a transformation. And he wasn't merely a guest. He was something else entirely, something neither fully human nor wholly alien. Whatever role he had been brought here to play, it was far greater than he had ever imagined. Yet even as the truth settled over him, another question arose, burning hotter than the rest. If this was only the beginning, what would come next? The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it gentle. It began as a low hum in the marrow of his bones, a vibration that resonated through every cell in his body. At first, he thought it might be an aftershock of the connection he'd felt with the queen and her people, a residual echo of their shared consciousness. But soon, the sensation grew sharper, more insistent, like threads weaving themselves into the fabric of his being. He stumbled backward, clutching at his chest as if trying to hold himself together. The platform beneath him shimmered faintly, its surface rippling as though alive. Around him, the alien figures remained still, their glowing masks fixed on him with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Their silence was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of their robes and the occasional flicker of light from the floating symbols encircling him. What's happening?" he managed to choke out, though no sound escaped his lips. His voice seemed trapped within him, swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the queen's essence now coursing through his veins. He could feel her, her thoughts, her emotions, her vast, ancient awareness, mingling with his own fragile human consciousness. It wasn't invasive, exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was something beyond those concepts, a force indifferent to comfort or pain. The queen stepped closer, her form radiating a warmth that made the air around her shimmer like heat waves. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those impossibly large eyes. "You are adapting," she said, her mental voice calm and steady. "This is necessary." "Necessary for what?" he demanded silently, though the words came out fragmented, half-formed. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms as he fought to regain control of his racing mind. "I didn't ask for this. I'm just a guest." Her gaze softened, almost pityingly. No one asks for the roles they are given. They simply accept them. Before he could respond, or even fully process her words, the world around him shifted again. The chamber dissolved into a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes, swirling faster and faster until he felt as though he were falling through a vortex of pure energy. Panic surged within him, but before it could take hold, the spinning slowed, and he found himself standing in an entirely different place. It was a forest, though unlike any forest he had ever seen. The trees towered hundreds of feet into the sky, their trunks composed of translucent crystal that refracted sunlight into dazzling rainbows. The ground beneath his feet pulsed faintly, as if breathing, and strange creatures flitted between the branches above, their bodies glowing softly like fireflies. A breeze carried scents both familiar and alien, earthy moss, sweet nectar, and something metallic that tingled against his senses. "Where am I?" he whispered aloud, his voice trembling. This time, the sound emerged clearly, echoing strangely in the dense atmosphere. "This is our origin," the queen replied, her voice filling his mind once more. "A fragment of our history, shared with you so you may understand." He turned sharply, searching for her, but she was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he felt her presence all around him, woven into the very fabric of this surreal landscape. As he walked forward cautiously, the ground responded to his steps, glowing faintly where his feet touched it. Each step sent ripples outward, as though he were walking on water. Ahead, he spotted movement, a group of beings emerging from the shadows between the trees. They were humanoid in shape but taller and leaner than the aliens he had met earlier, their skin shimmering like liquid silver. Their faces were unmasked, revealing features both beautiful and unsettling. Wide, almond-shaped eyes that glowed faintly, high cheekbones, and mouths that curved upward in perpetual smiles. They moved with an ethereal grace, their long limbs flowing like water as they approached him. One of them stopped directly in front of him, tilting its head curiously. Up close, he could see intricate patterns etched into its skin, shifting and changing like living tattoos. Without warning, it reached out and placed a hand on his forehead. A flood of images rushed into his mind. Planets forming from clouds of dust, civilizations rising and falling, wars fought with weapons of light and shadow. He staggered back, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the knowledge being forced into his brain. "These are our ancestors," the queen explained. "They shaped us, guided us, and laid the foundation for what we have become. And now, you will carry a piece of their legacy." "Why me?" he asked desperately, clutching his head as the visions continued to bombard him. "I'm nobody. Just some random human plucked off Earth because you needed someone expendable." The figure withdrew its hand, its expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence, save for the distant chirping of unseen creatures. Then, the queen's voice returned, softer this time, almost hesitant. "Expendability is a concept born of fear. You were chosen because you are adaptable. Because your species has proven capable of surviving despite its flaws. And because—" She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Before he could press her further, the scene shifted again. The forest faded, replaced by a barren wasteland under a blood-red sky. Jagged mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks wreathed in smoke and ash. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur, and the ground crunched beneath his feet like brittle glass. In the center of the desolate plain stood a massive structure, a spire of black stone that seemed to absorb the dim light around it. As he approached, he noticed figures moving near its base. They were hunched and grotesque, their forms twisted and malformed. Some crawled on all fours, while others dragged themselves along the ground, leaving trails of ichor in their wake. Their eyes glowed red, filled with malice and hunger. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Fear coiled tightly in his chest, making it hard to breathe. "This is what we guard against," the queen replied. The remnants of what we once were. The darkness that nearly consumed us. As if on cue, the creatures turned toward him, their heads snapping up in unison. Their mouths opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and they let out a chorus of guttural screams that sent shivers down his spine. He took a step back, heart pounding wildly, but before the creatures could advance, a blinding flash of light erupted from the spire. When the light faded, the creatures were gone, and the queen stood before him once more. Her form was less radiant here, her glow muted by the oppressive atmosphere. She extended a hand toward him, her expression unreadable. "Come," she urged. "There is more you must see." Reluctantly, he took her hand, and the world dissolved yet again. This time, he found himself in a vast, empty void. There was no ground beneath his feet, no sky above him, only an endless expanse of darkness dotted with pinpricks of light. Stars, he realized after a moment, though they seemed closer than any stars he had ever seen. Floating among them were shapes, ships, cities, entire worlds suspended in the void. Some were vibrant and alive, pulsing with energy and activity. Others were dark and silent, their surfaces cracked and crumbling. He recognized fragments of earth among them, familiar continents distorted and fractured, cities reduced to skeletal ruins. It was a vision of countless futures, each one branching off from decisions made or not made. "These are possibilities," the queen explained. "Paths your species may take. Some lead to greatness, others to ruin." "And why are you showing me this?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of what he was seeing. "What does any of this have to do with me?" Her grip tightened on his hand, and when she spoke, her voice was firm, almost stern. "Because you are part of this now. Whether you wish it or not, your fate is intertwined with ours. Your presence here changes everything." "How?" he demanded, pulling his hand free. "How does some random human change anything? I don't even know what I'm supposed to do." For the first time since he had arrived, the queen hesitated. Her luminous form flickered slightly, as if struggling to maintain its composure. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, tinged with something resembling uncertainty. "We do not know. Not entirely. But we believe, we hope, that you will help us find a way to prevent the darkness from returning." "The darkness," he echoed, his mind flashing back to the twisted creatures in the wasteland. "You mean those things?" "And others like them," she confirmed. "They are not confined to our past. They exist across time and space, waiting for moments of weakness, seeking opportunities to spread. If left unchecked, they will consume all life, including yours." He stared at her, the enormity of her words sinking in slowly. "So what you're saying is, you need me to fight them? To stop them somehow?" She nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Not alone. Together. With us. But first, you must understand who, and what, you truly are." Before he could respond, the void began to collapse inward, the stars and worlds shrinking until they disappeared entirely. He found himself back in the chamber where it had all begun, surrounded once more by the alien figures in their glowing masks. The queen stood before him, her form steady and resolute. "Your journey has only just begun," she told him. "And though the path ahead will be difficult, know this, you are not alone." As her words echoed in his mind, he felt a surge of determination rise within him, mingling with the lingering fear and confusion. Whatever lay ahead, whatever role he was meant to play, he knew one thing for certain. He could no longer deny the truth. He was no longer merely human. The chamber around him seemed to breathe, its crystalline walls pulsing faintly as if alive. The alien figures stood motionless, their glowing masks fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. He felt exposed, as though every thought, every flicker of doubt or fear, was laid bare before them. And yet, beneath the weight of their gaze, he also felt something else, a strange sense of belonging, as if this place, these beings, had always been waiting for him. The queen stepped forward, her radiant form casting soft shadows across the room. She raised a hand, and instantly, the air shimmered. A holographic projection materialized above the dais where her throne rested, a swirling galaxy filled with countless stars, planets, and nebulae. It was breathtakingly beautiful, But there was something unsettling about it too. Threads of darkness wove through the cosmic tapestry, tendrils of shadow that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. "This is the balance," she said, her voice resonating in his mind. "Light and dark, creation and destruction. For eons, we have maintained it. But the scales are tipping." He frowned, staring at the projection. "You mean those creatures? The ones I saw in the wasteland?" She nodded solemnly. "They are remnants of what we once were, fragments of chaos given form. When our ancestors first forged order from the void, they cast out the darkness, banishing it to the edges of existence. But nothing is ever truly gone. It lingers, waiting for cracks to appear, for weaknesses to exploit." Her words sent a chill down his spine. "And now it's coming back. Not just here," she corrected. "Everywhere. Across dimensions, across time. The darkness seeks to unravel all that exists, to return everything to the primordial chaos from which it came." "But why me?" he asked again, frustration creeping into his voice. "Why bring me here? What can I possibly do against something like that?" Her expression softened, though her eyes remained piercing. "Because you carry within you something unique. Something neither fully human nor fully alien. You are a bridge, a conduit between worlds, between species, between light and dark. Through you, we may find a way to restore the balance." He shook his head, overwhelmed. "I don't even understand what that means. How am I supposed to fight something I can't even comprehend?" "You will learn," she assured him. "But not alone. We will guide you, teach you, and together, we will face what comes next." Before he could respond, the projection shifted. The galaxy dissolved, replaced by images of Earth, familiar cities, sprawling landscapes, oceans teeming with life. But then the scene changed. Skies darkened, storms raged, and the land fractured under waves of unnatural energy. People fled in terror as shadowy figures emerged from the chaos, their forms indistinct but undeniably menacing. His breath caught in his throat. Is this going to happen?" "It already has," she replied gravely. "In one possible future. If we fail, this will become reality, not only for your world but for countless others." Despair threatened to overwhelm him, but then another image appeared, a figure standing amidst the devastation, surrounded by light so bright it nearly blinded him. The figure turned, and he realized with a jolt that it was himself, or at least, a version of himself. His eyes glowed with the same luminescence as the Queen's, and in his hands, he held what looked like a staff carved from starlight. Around him, the shadows recoiled, dissolving into nothingness. What is that?" he stammered, pointing at the vision. "That is who you can become," she said simply. "But the path to reach that point will not be easy. You must embrace the changes within you, accept the gifts and burdens we offer. Only then can you fulfill your role." He clenched his fists, torn between denial and resolve. "Even if I wanted to, how do I even begin? I'm not a hero. I'm not anything special." "Heroes are rarely born," she countered. "They are made. And you have already begun the process. The essence you absorbed during the ceremony, it is part of you now. It will grow stronger with time, shaping you into something greater than you imagine." As if to emphasize her point, a surge of warmth spread through his body, emanating from his core. It wasn't painful, but it was powerful, filling him with a sensation both exhilarating and terrifying. He stumbled back, clutching at his chest as the feeling intensified. Color swirled behind his eyelids, and for a brief moment, he felt connected to everything. The chamber, the aliens, the Queen, even the distant stars outside. When the sensation subsided, he opened his eyes to find the Queen smiling faintly. "Do you feel it?" she asked. "The potential within you?" He nodded slowly, still reeling from the experience. "Yes," he admitted. "But it's overwhelming." "It will be," she agreed. "For now, rest. Let your mind adjust to the changes. Tomorrow, your training begins." With that, the chamber began to dissolve around him, the walls fading into mist. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the Queen's luminous form, watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and sorrow. When he awoke, he found himself lying on a bed of silken threads that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The room was small but comfortable, its walls lined with bioluminescent plants that emitted a soothing glow. A gentle hum filled the air, rhythmic and calming, like the sound of waves lapping against a shore. Sitting up, he rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. It felt like a dream, too surreal, too fantastical to be real. Yet the lingering warmth in his chest told him otherwise. Whatever had occurred during the ceremony, whatever connection he now shared with the queen and her people, it was undeniable. A door slid open silently, and a figure entered. It was one of the aliens, though smaller and less imposing than the others he'd encountered. Its mask was simpler, adorned with delicate patterns that shifted subtly as it moved. In its hands, it carried a tray laden with food, or at least, what he assumed was food. The items on the tray were unrecognizable, some glowing faintly, others emitting faint wisps of steam. "You're awake," the being said, its voice surprisingly melodic compared to the telepathic communication he'd grown accustomed to. "Eat. You'll need your strength." He hesitated, eyeing the strange offerings warily. "What is all this?" "Nutrients tailored to your new physiology," it explained. "Your body is adapting rapidly. These will help sustain you." Reluctantly, he picked up one of the glowing orbs and took a cautious bite. To his surprise, it tasted sweet, like honey infused with citrus. Emboldened, he tried another item, then another, each one bursting with flavors both familiar and exotic. As he ate, the alien watched him closely, its head tilting slightly as if studying him. "You seem conflicted," it observed after a moment. "I am," he admitted, setting the tray aside. "Everything's happening so fast. I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is." The alien nodded knowingly. "Few are prepared for such transformations. But remember, you were chosen for a reason. Trust in yourself, and trust in us. We will guide you." Its words offered little comfort, but he appreciated the sentiment nonetheless. After finishing the meal, he stood and stretched, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he couldn't face it alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, he didn't have to. The alien gestured for him to follow, leading him out of the room and into a corridor bathed in golden light. As they walked, he noticed symbols etched into the walls, similar to the ones he'd seen during the ceremony. They pulsed faintly, as if responding to his presence. "Where are we going?" he asked. "To meet your instructor," the alien replied cryptically. "Someone who will teach you how to harness the power within you." His stomach tightened at the thought, but he forced himself to keep moving. One step at a time, he reminded himself. That was all he could do. At the end of the corridor, they reached a massive doorway framed by twisting vines of crystal. The alien pressed a hand against the surface, and the door slid open with a soft chime. Beyond it lay a vast arena bathed in silver light, its floor covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and swirl like liquid. Standing in the center of the arena was a figure cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by a hood. As they approached, the figure turned, revealing a face that was neither fully alien nor fully human, but somehow both. Its eyes glowed with an inner fire, locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath hitch. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. "I am Kale, your mentor. Are you ready to begin?" He swallowed hard, meeting Kale's gaze. "I think so." Kale smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Good. Because the first lesson starts now." With that, the ground beneath them erupted in a burst of light, and the training began. The arena transformed around them, the patterns on the floor glowing brighter as walls of energy rose from the ground, enclosing the space. Kale moved with precision, his every step deliberate, and gestured for him to follow. "Your power is raw," Kale said, his voice echoing. "But it can be shaped." He stumbled forward, unsure of what was expected, but Kale didn't wait. A pulse of energy shot toward him, forcing him to instinctively raise a hand. To his astonishment, a shimmering barrier formed, deflecting the attack. His heart raced as he stared at his trembling palm. "Good," Kale said, though his tone was clinical. Now strike back. Hours passed in a blur of motion and exhaustion. Each attempt left him drained, yet each failure brought clarity. By the end, he could summon bursts of light, shape them into weapons, and feel the threads of connection binding him to this alien world. Finally, Kale stopped, nodding approvingly. You've taken your first steps. But remember, mastery requires sacrifice. As they exited the arena, the queen awaited him, her presence calming yet charged with purpose. You are ready, she said, her mental voice resonating deeply. The darkness stirs. It is time. He nodded, resolve hardening within him. Though fear lingered, so did hope. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it, not just for himself, but for all that stood to be lost. And with that, the chamber doors opened, revealing the vast cosmos beyond.